This is IAQ Radio, Indoor Air Quality Radio, the voice of the indoor air quality industry, with your hosts, Radio Joe Hughes and the Z-Man, Cliff Zlotnick. And now, Radio Joe Hughes.
Good day and welcome to IAQ Radio Plus. This week, we welcome Dr. Joe Spurgeon for a discussion on surface dust samples, ERMI scores, and assessing mold exposure. Before we get started, let's thank our sponsors. They're the reason we can continue doing the show. And don't forget, after the show, you can continue the discussion at afterthoughts.iaqradio.com, sponsored by First OnSite. Our marquee sponsor is First OnSite at firstonsite.com. Our association sponsors are the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, ACGIH.org, the American Industrial Hygiene Association, AIHA.org, the Cleaning Industry Research Institute, CIRI Science.org, the Indoor Air Quality Association, IAQA.org, the Institute for Inspection, Cleaning, and Restoration Certification, IICRC.org. Industry sponsors are AEML Laboratories, AEMLINC.com, Particles Plus, ParticlesPlus.com, TSI Inc., TSI.com, Sunbelt Rentals, SunbeltRentals.com, April Air, April, AIRE.com, Healthy Indoors Magazine, HealthyIndoors.com.
And now you can win a cool prize. It's time for the IAQ Radio Trivia question. Be the first to correctly answer. Simply email your answer to czlotnick@cs.com. Or if listening live, just text your answer from your computer. And now, here's the Z-Man.
Hello, everyone. I'm sorry to report that no one identified the fence on the campus of Carnegie Mellon University as the 1993 Guinness Book of World Records holders for most painted object in the world. The IQ Radio Trivia question for today, May 6, 2022, has been sponsored by TSI Inc., an industry leader in precision instrumentation for the monitoring of indoor air. Learn how to expand your IAQ investigations at TSI.com. Here's today's IAQ Radio Trivia question. Name the EPA's technical contact for environmental measurement and monitoring. Back to you, Joe.
Okay, so today we've got Dr. Joe Spurgeon. He has a multidisciplinary doctorate degree in analytical chemistry and environmental health from the University of Pittsburgh. And he was a certified industrial hygienist from 1993 to 2013. His career has included working as a research chemist on the NBS lead paint poisoning program. He directed the FAA's combustion toxicology laboratory. He performed health assessments for the CDC's ATSDR program, implementing the US EPA's Laboratory Exposure Assessment Project, and has worked as a consultant specializing in microbial indoor air quality for the US Public Health Service. He has also performed over 4,000 residential and commercial investigations involving water intrusion, microbial contaminants, and has served as an expert witness in numerous mold cases. Welcome back, Joe.
Thank you.
Always great to have you. Let's jump right into it. We've got the presentation here. We're calling this now Surface Dust Samples, ERMI Scores, and Assessing Mold Exposure. I guess before we get started, what led to your interest in this topic and going into such detail and putting together a nice presentation like this?
Well, a couple of things. Number one, reviewing a lot of reports from a number of consultants and working as an expert witness allowed me to review those reports. And it seems to me as an industry, we've kind of overstepped the use of dust sampling and the use of things like ERMI scores. And secondly, I'm a little bit concerned about the way we use sampling methodologies, and we don't really consider the implications of the methods themselves, how we analyze our samples, and the implications of how we analyze them and the impact on our ability to interpret them. So I'd like to kind of get a discussion going always, if possible, within the industry on those topics.
All right. Well, let's jump right into it, Joe. John, if you could put that up. You may have to speak up a little bit, Joe. I have a little trouble hearing you, but.
Okay.
There we go. Get a little closer if you would. All right. So this is our title. I think we can jump to the next one.
All right. Again, some of the topics that we'll be talking about are sampling objectives, collecting surface dust samples, how they're analyzed by the laboratory, and how the reports are, how the results are reported. And I think that's a very important topic. The ERMI method and how it's used to assess occupant exposure potentials, and just maybe one slide on the Hershey method, just to make a point.
All right, next.
Next, yes, sampling objectives. Talk a little bit about occupant exposure potential versus occupant risk. Next. So sampling objectives. How will the sample results be used? And within the IAQ community, there's probably three primary objectives. Assessing building-related contamination, or BRC. And that's whether or not the structures, the systems, contents are contaminated. That's very typical, a common objective. They can be used to assess occupant exposure potential. That is, are there contaminants of concern? For example, mold, bacteria, allergens, etc., that are capable of causing adverse effects. And if there are they present at concentrations capable of causing those effects? Next.
And there's our third one. Okay.
Yeah, so the third primary objective is to assess occupant risk. And for example, are occupants experience adverse health effects due to the contaminants that were detected? And for example, should occupants vacate homes or offices? And in my opinion, that's the job of the treating physician, not the job of the mold investigator or independent environmental professional. In my opinion, we should expedite our report. If we find a bad situation, we should inform the client that they should get our report to the physician as soon as possible, and offer to explain our report to the physician if it's requested. But I run into a lot of situations where the IEP has recommended to the client that they should vacate their home or office. And I think that's maybe going a little bit too far. We don't really have that expertise or that function.
And even though you've got quite a background in that area, you're still telling people, and you yourself don't recommend people leave a home.
Well, I qualified for a doctorate in public health with a concentration in environmental health. I've had graduate work in toxicology and inhalation toxicology. And I managed the FAA's combustion toxicology laboratory for the better part of 10 years. So I think I'm probably better educated in this area than most of the IEPs doing this. And I certainly don't feel qualified to make those decisions, and I never have. So, yeah, I think we need to have some caution in that area.
All right. Good little warning for our audience there. Let's go to this next one here. Critical step.
Yeah, the next topic I'd like to talk about are collecting surface dust samples, and I believe that is a critical step. I think we're all familiar with the old adage of garbage in, garbage out, and anyone who's ever collected a field sample knows that it's not that simple to get a good sample. Easy to get a sample, but not easy to get a good sample. Next.
Let's go over why.
All right, let's do that. The sample describes the environment, and according to Occupant, and I've given the reference here, one of the primary challenges of assessing exposures to environmental contaminants is the collection of a representative sample, with the sampling step typically contributing the largest variability in the assessment of the results. And I think we're all familiar with this issue. So a sample that's not representative of the fungal loading in the indoor space that was sampled is not going to be representative of the occupant exposure potential in that space. And I hope we're all recognizing that this is an issue when we collect a sample. Next.
So if I take a sample of take a swab directly on an area where I got a little 2x2 square inch section of mold, I take a sample right on that, may not be representative of the exposure for the people in that room.
Yeah, especially if it was the only spot of visible mold in the entire property. Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah, we have a goal of collecting a sample that's representative of the indoor environment, but we also want to be aware that we also want to be able to interpret that sample. So let's take an example where we're taking a dust sample with a Swiffer cloth, for example, and the individual collects that one sample from the basement, the first floor, and the second floor from multiple surfaces of different types, and they're analyzing that sample with qPCR. That individual might argue that that is a representative sample of the indoor environment. Well, that's all well and good. But then I might argue that it's impossible to interpret the sample result for that sample. That individual may interpret it, but I would argue that it cannot be interpreted. So I think we want to recognize that we not only want a representative sample, we want a sample that can be interpreted.
You know, Joe, you do a lot of expert witness work. I'm guessing this is one area you spend a lot of time educating attorneys and discussing when it comes to reviewing other people's reports.
Yeah, this is an important point that I tend to hammer on.
Okay, and then I've got a quick text from the audience going back to your recommending a physician. Should that physician be qualified as an immunologist, allergist, general practitioner? Do you get to that point?
No, I don't get to that point. I think we all are aware that it's very difficult. If you do the best job you can and write a wonderful mold report, that's very good. I can write the best mold report that I possibly can and turn that over to a family physician, and they don't know what to do with it. And I think we're all aware of that problem. I don't know who to recommend as far as a physician goes on a local basis. So it's kind of a catch-22 to say,
yes, it is.
Local physician. I understand that. But
okay.
I also recognize that I'm not a doctor. So
I think it was a good clarification.
This is a problem with the entire industry.
Absolutely. All right, let's go to the next one, John.
Okay, so planning to collect a good sample. If the result is to be meaningful, I think we need to understand the sampling rationale, the reasoning behind the collection of the sample. So the sampling rationale includes, why am I collecting this sample in this location using this sampling? What do I expect to learn from the sample? Why am I requesting this method of analysis to be used on this sample? Are there assessment guidelines or decision criteria that I'm going to be able to use to interpret the sample results? And why am I going to use this particular method of data interpretation with this sample to achieve the objectives that I have for this project?
Let me clarify on this one, Joe. Are you saying this should be in the report, or you should just be thinking about these things before you develop your sampling rationale?
No, this is what, when I'm called by a client, I normally take a telephone interview when the client calls me. And I'm thinking about this during the telephone interview with the client when I'm coming up with my project plan and my sampling plan. So I want to know what I'm going to do when I get on site. Once I get on site, this is going to change. It's like coming up with a plan during a battle. I mean, the plan is nothing once you get on site, but at least you have an idea of what you're going to do when you get there. So selecting a method, a sampling method, for example, very few standardized method or validated methods for mold sampling, and collecting a sample that's both representative and that can be interpreted is not a simple task. Very few recommendations. Sampling methods are not a sexy topic in academia, and they're not well funded. You can't get money to research them. So finding reliable guidance on method selection is very difficult. Next. These are the criteria I use for evaluating methods and for selecting methods and putting them in my toolbox, for example. And I call them the SOX criteria. It's just basic guidance. But does the method have significance for the sample result? That is, are there numerical guidelines for interpreting the lab report? And I know numerical guidelines is a hot button, but there can be explicit guidelines that are written down, consensus guidelines from a consensus body, or implicit guidelines that we call professional judgment. And I will suggest to you that it's impossible to interpret a numerical laboratory report, spores per cubic meter, for example, without using numerical guidelines. It's impossible. What we normally do is use implicit guidelines, that is professional judgment, to interpret that report. But in the back of our mind, we have to have some numerical guideline to interpret a numerical laboratory report. Objective decision criteria for interpreting the sample result. Can we determine whether or not that sample result is low, average, or high? If we can't, why collect the sample?
There you go. Yeah.
Are there consistent assessments of condition across project and between inspectors independent of experience or bias? If we get the same result in 2 or 3 different projects, are we going to make the same decision? Are we consistent? And is there a stable basis for assessment that does not vary with local conditions? For example, if you're taking an air sample and using indoor-outdoor comparisons, are outdoor sport counts stable? Do you make the same decision from property to property?
Yes, next.
Okay, people might be curious why I took these 4 sampling methods on the front of my book for carpets, but in my opinion, only one of these 4 sampling methods meet the SOX criteria and describe the exposure potential of a carpet dust sample. So what I'm trying to illustrate, or the concept that was in my mind, that there are problems that exist with very common sampling methods. And as a matter of fact, the least used sampling method is the only one that meets these criteria. The most commonly used sampling method doesn't meet these criteria, for example. So the next section, I'm going to discuss one of these problems. So
before you do, Joe, could you go back, John? Let's just go over these 4 methods real quick for those that aren't as familiar with your work. The top one, you got a little template there, and you're using a cassette to suck up dust. Go ahead.
Well, it's a closed-face cassette with a beveled tip tubing on it, and it's using an area template. Yeah.
It's attached to a pump, a sampling pump that draws air through there.
Right. Then we have the open-faced fixed area cassette. And then we have just an open-faced cassette that's just brushed across an unmeasured area of carpet. And then we have basically a area template with not a micro vacuum, but a vacuum to vacuum up carpet dust.
And are we going to tell people which one you think is the one that is that meets the SOX criteria?
Well, I have a whole chapter on comparing these methods, and it's the one on the left in the middle with the open-faced fixed area microvac cassette. It has the least relative standard deviation and the most sensitivity, and you can develop decision criteria based on that methodology.
And that, just for a quick, so for those that aren't familiar, the one underneath the title there with the little wooden box, that's typical of what people use for an ERMI sample?
Yeah, yes.
Or it should be.
And for other methods, but yes, that was used for the ERMI sample, yes.
Okay, let's go to the next one, John.
Okay, let's talk about analyzing dust samples and reporting the results. And a couple of comments. First of all, when you submit your sample to a laboratory, you have options, and you should be an informed consumer of laboratory services. And I want to make a comment that, in my opinion, this is a very important section to understand. So if you have any questions on this presentation, they really should be about this section. This is a critical section to understand.
Okay.
So next. All right, this is an example about selecting the reporting basis for your sample. This was a story that John Tiffany told on himself. And it was about a failed clearance because of choosing the wrong reporting basis for a sample. And the first thing to understand that mold is in the carpet dust, not in the carpet fibers. So this was a project that he had back in the 90s, and it was in a corporate Fortune 50 corporate headquarters. And the CEO had caught a cold, and he didn't think he should have a cold. So John got a very nice contract to do an investigation in the corporate headquarters because the CEO had caught a cold. So part of the carpet sampling was that they set the clearance criteria in colony forming units per milligram, which was correct. Then they cleaned the carpet, and they failed to meet the clearance criteria. So they cleaned it again, and it failed to meet the clearance criteria. And they actually did it a third time, and it failed. And John had to finally go to the corporate CEO and admit that the clearance criteria were incorrect. They were sampling a larger and larger and larger area of carpet to collect the same weight of dust, but that dust contained the same CFUs of mold. So they could not clear the carpet. So he had to convince the CEO to change the clearance criteria from CFUs per milligram of dust to CFUs per square foot of dust. And once they did that, then the carpet cleared. So this just points out the importance of how you report your sample results and the idea of thinking about what you're doing before you do it.
And not only how you report your sample results, but how you instruct the lab to give you your sample results.
Yes. But if you don't think to measure the area that you sampled before you do it, you don't have that data. You can't report it on an area basis. So you have to know the sampling rationale, the sampling parameters before you start, or you haven't got the information available to you.
Excellent. Let's go to the next one.
Okay, so analyzing surface dust samples. So how the samples analyzed and reported by the laboratory does affect the ability to assess both building-related contamination and occupant exposure potential. And the options for reporting dust samples, basically there's three options. So the standard method that the laboratory is going to use, I call the weight analyzed basis. And the result is spore equivalents per milligram. And this is what you're all familiar with. So it's reported as spore equivalents per milligram of dust analyzed. And that last word is critical, of dust analyzed. The second option is total weight basis. And here you have to request the laboratory to weigh the sample. And the laboratory analyzes spore equivalents per milligram. Then they multiply that by the total weight of the sample, and they will report to you spore equivalents per sample. The third option is the area basis, where you measure the area that was sampled. You request the sample to be weighed. They report to you spore equivalents per sample. You divide that by the area that was sampled. And in your report, you report spore equivalents per square inch, per square centimeter, per square foot, whatever you want. But you report it on an area basis. And that's what I will suggest to you is the preferred methodology. Okay, next.
Joe, before we go, I've got a question. Is spore equivalence, what type of analysis is that?
qPCR.
Okay, I think that's important to clarify. So this is if you're using qPCR. All
I
right.
knew what I was talking about.
You knew. I knew too, but I wanted to make sure everybody knows.
Can you real quick go to the next slide? Just let me see what it says. Okay, go back now. Okay, yeah. All right, so this is a little bit of a typo, but this is a carpet dust example. Let's just assume in this example that similar dust samples were collected in, I'm going to say on 2 floors of a house rather than in 2 houses using a microvac cassette, and that you submit the 2 samples to a laboratory for analysis without any other directions, just using a typical chain of custody. Okay.
Next.
So if you do that, they're going to use, by default, the weight analyzed basis to analyze your samples. So they're not going to weigh your sample, and they're just going to take a 5 milligram portion of each sample and analyze it. So let's assume that the dust collected was 100 milligrams of dust on the first floor and 10 milligrams on the second floor. And they're going to take 5 milligrams from each sample, and they're going to analyze it. And let's assume that we had 1,000 spore equivalents detected in both 5 milligram portions of samples, so that they found 200 spore equivalents per milligrams reported for both floors. So as far as the inspector is going to learn from the laboratory, there was the same exposure potential reported for both floors. 200 spore equivalents per milligram. That's what's going to be reported in the laboratory report. But the total fungal loading is actually 20,000 spore equivalents on the first floor and 2,000 spore equivalents on the second floor. So the cleanliness of the carpets differed by a factor of 10, although the inspector is never going to learn this, not based on the laboratory report.
And this was because they just went with the weight of the weight analyzed basis.
Right. This is the default standard operating procedure for most laboratories.
Okay.
And if you don't tell them different, that's what they're going to use.
All right. Next.
All right. So instead, let's assume that the mold inspector requested or wanted to use an area basis to report their results. So in this example, the inspector measures the area that was sampled, requests the analysis on a total weight basis as spore equivalents per sample, and that's what's reported to him. So the report's spore equivalents per sample, and then the results are standardized by area, either by square inch, per square centimeter, per square foot, whatever you want to choose, doesn't make any difference. Using this method, the sample results are standardized. And since they're standardized, just like spores per cubic meter, they can be compared. And this method accounts for variations in both dust weight and area sample. And this is just an example of calculations, but the point is, using the area basis method, the inspector receives a report from the laboratory that shows the difference in the cleanliness of the 2 carpets. 200 spore equivalents per square centimeter, 20 spore equivalents per square centimeter on the first and second floors. So now the inspector is aware of the difference in cleanliness between the 2 carpets that were sampled. A big difference.
Okay. Big difference.
Okay. Not only that, if you use the area basis, they now can take those data and compare those results between projects. On an area analyzed basis, you cannot compare the results between projects. Secondly, looking at an area basis, I've given you 2 references here, but the health effects were better associated with results reported on an area basis rather than a weight basis. Results reported on an area basis are standardized by area and allow conditions and occupant exposure potentials to be compared between projects. You cannot do this if your results are reported on a weight analyzed basis.
Gotcha.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Joe.
All right. You cannot compare airborne samples of spores using raw counts. You can compare them using spores per cubic meter because spores per cubic meter are standardized based on air volume. You have to standardize your results before you can compare the results with other results.
Excellent. I think this is a good time for us to break for halftime, Joe, and we'll come back with the second half of our interview with Dr. Joe Spurgeon. We're talking dust sampling, surface dust samples, ERMI scores. We'll get into that in a moment, and assessing mold exposures. Our marquee sponsor is First On Site, your trusted full-service disaster recovery and property restoration company at firstonsite.com. Association sponsors are ACGIH, Advancing Careers of Professionals in Environmental Health, Industrial Hygiene, and Safety, interested in defining their science. ACGIH.org. AIHA, Healthy Workplaces, A Healthier World. AIHA.org. The Cleaning Industry Research Institute. See more deeply through science and research. CIRI Science.org. The Indoor Air Quality Association, IAQA.org. The IICRC, a nonprofit standards development and certifying body for the cleaning and restoration industry, IICRC.org. Industry sponsors are AEML Laboratories, free shipping, great pricing, same-day results with no rush fee, AEMLINC.com. Particles Plus, feature-rich particle counters and air quality instrumentation. Count on us, particlesplus.com. TSI Inc., an industry leader in precision instrumentation for monitoring indoor air. Learn how to expand your IAQ investigations, TSI.com. Sunbelt Rentals, availability, reliability, and ease for all your IAQ and restoration needs at sunbeltrentals.com. April Air, healthy home, April, AIRE.com. And Healthy Indoors Magazine, a free online magazine for industry professionals and consumers, healthyindoors.com. Okay, we're back for the second half of our interview. Let's jump right back into it, John. We're going to get into the ERMI section now, I believe.
All right. A little bit about the ERMI method now, changing gears. We're going to be talking about building-related contamination very briefly and occupant exposure potential, with most of the emphasis on occupant exposure potential. Next. All right. Some issues with ERMI scores. So unless the collection method looked like this photo and it was collected from a carpet and it was reported on a weight analyzed basis, then it was not an ERMI sample, and we should be very careful using ERMI scores to assess the result, because it was really not an ERMI sample. Okay.
Joe, I see this all the time. I mean, people swiffering, on the top of their refrigerator or mailboxes and comparing them and so forth. So what you're saying is if ERMI was developed to be used this way, and there's really no support for those other types of other methods for using the ERMI.
I don't want to say that. What I'm saying is they should be using an ERMI score associated or correlated with that type of sampling and from that type of surface.
And that doesn't exist, does it?
The standard ERMI score based on carpet sampling using this methodology from the initial 1,000 and some odd houses should not be used.
And I don't think you have a problem with ERMI in general. It's just the misuse of it.
Yeah, I'm not going to argue about the initial use of ERMI. I think it's been overextended by the IAQ community.
Gotcha. Okay, John, there we go.
All right, now that I've said that, the data that I'm going to present were collected with filter cassettes and surface swabs. They were reported on an area basis rather than a weight analyzed basis, so they're not ERMI samples. So neither are Swiffer samples ERMI samples. However, what I'm going to present, we can consider the implications of the concepts I'm going to present, not necessarily the numbers. So look at the concepts, don't look at the numbers necessarily, but look at the types of information and consider those. I think they're valid. So again, concentrate on the concepts. I think they're valid. Next. All right, so the initial ERMI method, as Joe was saying, was developed to assess building-related contamination using carpet dust. And if you look at the right-hand y-axis, percent of homes in the U.S. plotted versus ERMI scores, and that was the initial use. And I have no argument with that. Next, please. However, I think the IAQ community uses ERMI scores as a measure of occupant exposure potential. And now we're talking about the right-hand y-axis. And now we switch to looking at correlating ERMI scores with mold level. And that is total fungal loading. And I think that's incorrect. ERMI scores are a function of the difference between group 1 and group 2 fungi, not the total fungal loading. So I think right off the bat, we have a difference. ERMI scores are not associated with mold level. They're associated with the difference between group 1 and group 2 mold levels. So that's a problem to begin with. Next. So let's look at what happens when we do associate ERMI scores with mold level. So here we have a plot of ERMI scores from -6 to +5. And it's plotted against group 1 contaminant fungi, the concentration of those fungi. And what we get is a bell-shaped curve. Okay, just a standard bell-shaped curve. And this is what you would actually expect because ERMI scores are calculated using the logs. We don't want to get into that, but this is really what you would expect.
Okay.
So what we have is the highest occupant exposures are not at an ERMI score of +20. The highest fungal loadings and occupant exposure potentials are at an ERMI score of between 0 and 2. Okay, right in here.
And that's because we're just looking at the group 1 fungi now. We're not subtracting out the group 2. No?
You can do this for group 1, group 2, total fungi. This is just an example, but you get the same shape. You get a bell-shaped curve.
All right.
It's a function of using the logs to calculate the ERMI graph. That's why.
All right.
So no matter what you use, group 1, group 2, total, doesn't make any difference.
But what if you subtract group 2 from group 1?
Well, you subtract group 2 from group 1, you get the ERMI curve.
Right. But this is not subtracted out.
What I'm talking about is can you use or should you use ERMI scores to associate with occupant exposure potential? And what I'm saying is you should not.
All right.
And this is why. Maximum concentrations occur at ERMI scores between 0 and 2.
Okay, next.
All right, here's some carpet dust samples, 39 carpet dust samples. Again, this is total fungi now, not just group 1. This is total fungi, total loading versus ERMI score. And we have three groups of samples. So the first group down here in this green box is from ERMI scores of -6 to +15. And they're all very low concentrations of fungi. So basically, no exposure potential at all, very low exposure potential over a very wide range of ERMI scores, -6 to +15. So again, no association with exposure potential with ERMI scores. We also have a group at -6. So at -6, we have a 49-fold variation in total fungi. And from -2.5 to +2.5, we have a 100-fold variation in total fungal concentration, from 700 to 70,000 spore equivalents. So again, I can't find any association with total fungal loading and occupant exposure potential with ERMI scores.
Okay.
Next.
Next.
All right, if we look at individual houses, we have houses 1, 2, and 3, all with an ERMI score of +0.7, total fungi from 13 to 69,000, with a variation with a 5-fold variation in total fungi. We have houses 4 through 6 with an ERMI score of -6, total fungi varying from 500 to 34,000, with a 68-fold variation in total fungi. And we look at houses 2 and 6, we have total fungi of 39,000 with +0.7 score, and house 6 with 34,000 fungi with a -6 score. Again, no association between ERMI scores and total fungi.
John, could you go back to the first ERMI slide that shows the, keep going. I just want people to be, there we go. Hey, that one right there. So I just want people to be able to kind of relate back to this slide on the, and that will help with what we just saw on the other slide. Go ahead back, John. So -10 to -4 is in the green area. Okay. Next.
All right, we can also set up, this is just an example I set up, but we can also have a situation where total fungi at 110,000 has an ERMI score of +1, and total fungi at 150,000 has a total ERMI score of +0.3. So the higher the fungal loading, the lower the ERMI score. So again, there's no logic here as far as associating ERMI scores with total fungal loading and occupant exposure potential.
Okay, next.
So I have some issues with that.
Understood.
All right. So this is going on to another topic. This is a different topic. This has to do with just surface sampling itself, not with ERMI. So we're moving to a different topic now.
Okay.
So this is sampling surfaces other than carpets. And the interpretation of sample results for different surfaces. So what I see often is multiple surfaces often sampled using Swiffer cloths, for example, or any sample medium. And these are plots of total fungi. And let's just assume you get a laboratory report that says the sample contained 10,000 spore equivalents of total mold, for example. So how do we interpret that? Is that high, low, average? What is it? Well, the point is that if that sample had been collected from an air return, that would have been the 10th percentile concentration, very low, no problem at all. If it had been collected from a carpet, it would have been the 50th percentile concentration, so an average, typical concentration. If it had been collected from an article of clothing, it would have been the 97th percentile concentration, so very high, very elevated, and it would have been a concern. So understanding where the sample was collected is important to the interpretation of that sample result. Next. Okay, and putting it in terms of ERMI scores, this is what the relative results would have been like, all the way from a -8 to a plus 16 or 18, depending on what surface was sampled. So the conclusion is that the surface sampled should be considered when assessing the sample result. And I don't think we do that very well. I don't even think this is understood very well.
No, it's not. And I think it goes back to your slide that said ERMI was developed for a certain thing, carpet.
Well, it was developed for carpet. And if you want to develop an ERMI score for air returns, that's fine. Or air grills, that's fine.
But don't use the carpet score for a return.
Or a Swiffer that's collected from the basement, the first floor, and the second floor. Yes.
Even worse. Okay, next.
All right, so some of the characteristics of ERMI scores. So ERMI scores only apply to carpet dust samples that were collected using a specific sampling method, not to mixed surfaces sampled using a Swiffer, for example. Results are reported on a weight analyzed basis rather than an area basis. So sample results are not standardized and really can't be compared. Scores are calculated based on the difference between group 1 and group 2 fungi. So scores do not reflect total fungal loading or occupant exposure potential. And an ERMI score does not represent a unique fungal loading for assessing occupant exposure potential. Next. All right, so assessing occupant exposure potential, I'm going to be talking about an alternative method using total fungal loading. So let's see what we can do with that. I've been kind of raining on everyone's parade so far. There is an alternative approach that I use, and I can only describe what I use. There's probably many approaches, but it can be used to assess building-related contamination and occupant exposure potential if you wish to use it. The method may look complex, but it's actually fairly simple to learn and to use, and you can put it in operation in a weekend. I've taught several people how to use it. It takes about a weekend to put it into operation. Once you do that, it is operational, and you can kind of forget about it and use it. Next. So this is just an example. Let's assume these are 18 samples that you've collected from soft surfaces. And these are the data for orobasidium, for example. So you would list the samples from lowest to highest concentration. And for example, the 9th sample out of 18 would be the 50th percentile sample. And this has a concentration of around 2,000 spore equivalents. So going to the next one. What you would do is create a table. Like the 50th percentile was 2,000 spore equivalents for orobasidium. You would create a table like this from the 16th, 50th, 75th, 95th percentile concentrations. And once you create this table for orobasidium, you could create it for Penicillium brevicompactum, for total fungi, for Stachybotrys, for Cladosporium, whatever you want. You could do it for soft surfaces, air returns, air supplies, hard surfaces, whatever you want. Once you create these tables, you're done. You can stop. That's all you need. What I'm going to be doing is using graphs in the following presentation just to illustrate the concept. You don't need the graphs. All you need is a table like this, and it doesn't take you very long to create one. And,
Joe, how is this sample? Is this an open face cassette sample, or is this what kind of sample are we looking at?
No, this is a this is from a soft surface microvac. However you sample, this is an open face cassette that I use.
Okay.
Yes, but however you sample, you use your methodology because you want it to reflect your methodology.
And I got a question from the audience. Is this method in your book?
It is, and I also I've taught several people how to use it. Contact me; I'd be glad to help you if you're interested.
All right.
Okay, so again, this is soft surface microvac cassette. These are the plots, and also it can be just a simple table. I'm just using plots to make it visual for you. But these are total fungi. These are total aspergillus, total ERMI, 36 ERMI fungi, aspergillus, total penicillium. So we can see that total fungi, the 50th percentile is 3,000 spore equivalents. So how can this help us? Let's go to the next one. So these are air supply grills collected using swab samples. So if the samples are collected from air supply grills using a swab sample analyzed by qPCR, the point is you can use this graph or the table, as I indicated to you, to interpret the next 10, 50, or 100 samples that you collect using this methodology from air supply grills. And that's very powerful. So for a couple of hours work done on a Saturday morning, you can interpret the next 100 samples you collect.
And air supply grills are an interesting choice of location. And I know you can do this in any number of locations, but maybe you could just spend a minute on why air supply grills can be so informative.
Yeah, because the air delivery system can be a source of occupant exposure. If I have the resources available to me during an inspection, I like to sample the air return, the air supply, and horizontal surfaces. And I like to correlate the results for those three locations. I consider what's on the air supply grill or the boot of the grill a potential occupant exposure source. There can be a lot of stuff in a wet HVAC system. I want to know what's coming out of the system, not what's in the system. What's coming out of the system, what's on the air supply grill, is probably what's being exposed into the breathing zone of the occupants. And if I can correlate what's on the grill and what's on horizontal surfaces, I'm even more certain of what's been circulating in the indoor air.
Excellent. Next, John.
All right. So how can we interpret those samples then? This may look complex. It's not. What we're interested in is the 50th percentile concentration, which is the median concentration, and the average concentration, which is the 73rd percentile, but we're going to call it the 75th percentile. And also, if we were doing clearance sampling, the 16th percentile concentration, which is one standard deviation below the median. And the 84th percentile, which is one standard deviation above the median. Don't even worry about this in this situation. But the median concentration and the average concentration. Next. Okay, why? So if I'm assessing building-related contamination, I want to use the 50th percentile concentration to assess building-related contamination. If I'm assessing occupant exposure potential, I want to use the 75th percentile concentration, because the dose is equal to the average concentration times the exposure time. So those are the two concentrations I'm interested in. All right. Next. All right, here's how I determine whether or not concentrations are typical or elevated. So here's the cumulative percentile distributions from the 10th percentile to the 95th percentile for the ERMI group 1 and group 2 fungi. And if we look at the percentiles, some of them are in blue and some of them are in red. So these are the ratios of the group 1 contaminant fungi to the group 2 common environmental fungi. And those that are in blue are those where the common environmental fungi dominate. Those that are in red are where the contaminant fungi dominate. So we're switching from typical environments to contaminated environments. And that switchover is at the 70th percentile concentration. Okay? So that's my break point. So how I analyze it is this way. First, I use the distribution of total fungi for the 36 ERMI fungi rather than a score to assess condition. That is, I use that to assess building-related contamination or the clean versus discard decision for soft surface items, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Second, I then use the distribution of the individual fungi to identify contaminants of concern. That is, to assess occupant exposure potentials.
Interesting. Next.
So here's the distributions for all 36 ERMI fungi, group 1 fungi, group 2 fungi, and total fungi. So I use the distributions for the group 1 and group 2 and total fungi to assess building-related contamination. And I use the distributions for the 36 fungi to assess occupant exposure potential. Okay. Now go to the next.
Next.
All right, so here's an example of a carpet dust report. It's a real report, and it's from one of the individuals I taught how to use this methodology. So it's a real system. The first thing I'll point out is orobasidium. And the reason I point that out is that it's the largest number in the middle column. So everybody's eye just immediately goes towards orobasidium. It's 2,000. But we don't know whether it's important or not. But if you look at the last column, then we can see, yeah, it's important. It's 85th percentile concentration. So it's elevated. Right. So we know it's elevated. If we look at chitomium is 29 spore equivalents. But if we look at Aspergillus ocratius, it's 28 spore equivalents for the same concentration. So is one important and one not important? Are they both important? Are they both not important? Well, chitomium is at the 40th percentile concentration. Ocratius is at the 90th percentile concentration. Mm-hmm. So chitomium is kind of typical concentration, nothing to worry about. Ocratius, 90th percentile, it's elevated. If we look at total spores detected, I didn't indicate the group 2 fungi, but we're given the total fungal loading. So I can evaluate the condition of the space that was sampled. And I can evaluate total fungal loading and occupant exposure potential in general and building-related contamination to see what the condition of the space was. And fourth, I can tell the client and I can tell any physician that's involved that we had 6 contaminants of concern detected. In the last column, the red dots indicate those specific fungi that were detected at elevated concentrations. So we get a lot more information from this approach than simply an ERMI score.
This is all from a carpet dust sample.
Yeah.
And just one.
Well, you take as many as you want, as many as the client can afford.
Right.
I'm not a proponent of just taking one sample, but sometimes you have resources to work with.
Sure. Sure.
But if I'm only going to take one sample, I would rather have a report like this than simply an ERMI score.
Yep. I agree. Next.
This is a HRTSME method. I'm not going to go over this. If anyone's interested, it's on the report. But the next, please.
Next.
All right. So this is what I want to get to is about for HRTSME. This is the prevalence of the 5 HRTSME fungi by surface type. And we have carpet, soft surface, clothing, hard surface, air returns, and supplies. And the point is that if you're going to use, whether it's an ERMI score or a HRTSME score or whatever, that all of these fungi are not always detected on every type of surface. we have 93 samples, and this is the prevalence on 93 different surface samples, the prevalence of detection. So if you're going to use something like HERTSME, HERTSME scores were based on less than 3% of the fungal loading and typically less than 1% of the fungal loading. And on many of these surfaces, these fungi weren't even detected. So the sampling locations are an obvious influence on the interpretation of the results. And that's the only point I want to make.
Okay, next.
So in summary, ERMI scores have several limitations as currently applied in IAQ investigations. I think they only should be applied to carpet dust samples. They're based on a specific sampling method, reported using the weight analyzed basis, and they do not reflect total fungal loading. Next. And with that, I will close out my presentation.
Joe, with that, I want to go to the roundup, John, and I will get to Ralph. I'll get to your question in the roundup. The roundup is brought to you by April Air, providing healthy humidity, ventilation, and air purity solutions for new and existing homes. April Air, healthy air, healthy home at aprilaire.com. Okay, John, let's go back to that presentation about the third from the last PowerPoint. I've got a question. Isn't Wallamia semi present above your op point of 70%? This one here, yeah. One of the our audience said, "Isn't Wallamia present above your op point of 70?"
Yeah, it's at 75%.
Yeah, you just didn't put a red dot there, I guess.
Yeah, you could. I mean, it would be that's your professional judgment as to what percentage you hit it. Yeah.
Okay.
But
Excellent.
It is above 70%. 75's on borderline. I just hit the ones above 80% and above. Is what I hit.
Gotcha. Cliff, final questions, comments?
Yeah, just one question, Joe. One of the things I've learned from looking at thousands of HVAC systems in homes, particularly homes that have fire damage, a lot of times the residue found on the supply grill or on the supply register is inconsistent with the residue inside the ductwork, because what happens is an airstream is coming out of that register, and when you have a lot of sort of residue in the air in that room, it impinges onto that register. It didn't come through. This didn't come through the register to get in the room. This is impingement of dust that's already in the room. So I just wondered if you've ever encountered the same thing, or if you could comment. Or
I can't really comment. It's a matter of you have to use your procedures and standardize on it, get a database, and compare your results within your database. My point is, establish a database for how you sample and how you investigate, and compare the next results you get against your database. That's my recommendation. I don't think enough of us do that.
No, very few, actually. Joe, I just want to kind of summarize real quick. You did a good summary, but I'm getting the impression that ERMI, maybe not ERMI so much as qPCR, has some real potential if used properly.
Oh, yeah. I personally, I believe qPCR is a very good methodology. I don't even know, I've been retired for a while, but my gosh, yes, it's very good. I still think there's places to use culturable samples. I use culturable samples and qPCR, depending on the objective of my sampling and the project objectives.
I also really like the way you differentiate between building-related contamination and occupant exposure potential, I think is the terminology you use. I get the impression that most people get them mixed up. And what they're really trying to do is figure out if there's building-related contamination, and they automatically assume that's also an occupant exposure potential. Comment?
Yeah, they're two different things. If I were going to take an air sample in a house, for example, and I were interested in assessing building-related contamination, okay, I might take 5-minute slit impaction cassette samples. Fine. If I'm going to assess occupant exposure potential, I'm going to take 60 to 90-minute filtered cassette samples. So I have to understand my objective, and I differentiate between those two objectives, and I'm going to use different sampling methods. If I'm taking surface dust samples, building-related contamination, okay, take a tape lift sample if you're looking at BRC. If I'm looking at occupant exposure potential, I'm going to be using qPCR or culturable samples. So to me, there is a difference.
Absolutely. And I've always felt like a lot of IEPs should stick more to determining if there's building-related contamination and stay away from the occupant exposure potential. They just don't have the go ahead.
I kind of disagree with that. Well, then don't take people's money. And
okay.
Don't give them the impression that they're doing a complete inspection.
But isn't building-related contamination important?
Yes, it's very important. But if there's an occupant exposure, don't give the people the impression that you're doing a complete inspection.
Gotcha. Joe, anything you'd like to add before we go? It's always a pleasure talking with you, always enlightening, and we love having you on.
No, I've been hitting this idea of sampling methodology and lack of validation for many, many years. I haven't made much progress, but maybe someone's listening.
I think you're making a little more progress than you may realize here. I don't know. I know there's a group of people that you and I email with quite regularly that are at least trying to figure this out, and that's a start.
Great.
All right. Well, I want to thank Dr. Joe Spurgeon for joining us today. This was always, sometimes I get a little over my head at times, but that's okay. I'll go back and listen again and check it out. But for those of you that have any questions, please send questions to me at joe.hughes@iaqtraining.com. I know Joe's always interested in getting comments and feedback on his presentations. He doesn't think he has all the answers. He wants our input as well, and especially those of you that have some good background in this type of thing. Also, if you get a chance, join us on afterthoughts.iaqradio.com, sponsored by First On Site. This is Radio Joe Hughes saying thanks to Dr. Joe Spurgeon, my co-host, the Z-Man, Cliff Zlotnick. John, you got to have faith at the controls. Most importantly, our audience and sponsors. We will be back in 2 weeks live, but next week we got a great flashback show for you. Let's see. David Jacobs will be with us in 2 weeks live from the National Center for Healthy Housing. So come back and join us for the next episode of IAQ Radio Plus.
For IAQ Radio, I'm Spike Reel saying thanks for listening.